So your nonprofit is thinking about raising funds in New Hampshire? You probably assume the first thing you've got to do is register to solicit donations, right? Well, what if I told you that in New Hampshire, that's not quite how it works. The rules there are a little different, and that key difference is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
This explainer is part of our multi-state fundraising compliance series, where we try to make these really complex rules a lot more practical for nonprofit leaders like you. And this resource is brought to you by our friends at Ironwood Registrations.
Okay, let's dive right in. New Hampshire really isn't a league of its own compared to most other states when it comes to charitable oversight. And it all boils down to the fundamental reason, the trigger, for registration in the first place. So just think about it for a second. In almost every other state, what's the one action that kicks off the whole registration process? I'm willing to bet most of you are thinking the same thing: asking for money, soliciting. And you'd usually be 100% right. But not in New Hampshire. This slide really gets to the heart of it. You see, most states are focused on the act of asking for donations. But New Hampshire, they care about the fact that you are holding or using assets for a charitable purpose inside their state. It's just a much, much broader definition. And the group that keeps an eye on all this is the Charitable Trusts Unit. They're part of the state's Department of Justice. And their focus? It lines up perfectly with that broader definition we just talked about. They're overseeing any organization that's managing charitable assets, not just the ones who are actively out there fundraising.
So, if the trigger isn't just asking for money, what does that actually mean for your nonprofit? Let's get into that, because the list of organizations that have to register is probably a lot wider than you'd expect.
As you can see, the scope is pretty broad. I mean, of course, it applies to charities based in New Hampshire, but it also catches out-of-state organizations that have enough activity going on. And here it is, the key part. It applies to any group that simply holds funds for charitable purposes. Soliciting is on the list, sure, but it's just one of several triggers, not the only one.
And check this out, another crucial detail. The countdown doesn't start when you send out your first fundraising email. It actually starts the moment you begin using your assets for your mission in the state. From that point, you've got 6 months to get registered. It's a completely different timeline to have on your radar. Now, what about those of you who aren't based in the state? New Hampshire uses what they call a reasonable minimum contact standard. What does that mean? Well, if you get a couple of random, unsolicited donations from New Hampshire, you're probably okay. But the second your fundraising becomes ongoing, or you're targeting people in the state, or it becomes significant, you've probably hit that standard and it's time to register.
Okay, so let's say you've figured out your organization does fall under these rules. What does getting registered actually involve? Let's walk through the practical steps to get you started.
You know, the process itself is pretty standard stuff. You're going to need your core documents, your articles of incorporation, bylaws, and that IRS determination letter. You'll also need to send in your most recent Form 990. And here's an important little detail for smaller nonprofits. The short 990N e-postcard is not accepted. Then you just add a list of your officers and directors, and you can file the whole package online or by mail.
And here's some good news for your budget. Getting started isn't going to break the bank. As you can see, the one-time initial filing fee is just $25. Pretty reasonable. All right, so once you're registered, you have to stay compliant. But just like pretty much everything else we've talked about, New Hampshire's approach to annual reporting is, you guessed it, a little unique. So here's the deal, and this is a crucial point. There is no formal annual renewal of your registration. Instead, what's required is an annual financial report. It's a subtle difference in words, but it's an important distinction to know.
And that annual report comes with its own fee. To stay in good standing, you'll need to pay $75 each year when you file.
The deadline is fairly standard. It's due 4.5 months after your fiscal year closes. So, if you're on a calendar year ending December 31st, your report is due by May 15th. The state is pretty good about allowing a 6-month extension, but you do have to ask for it before the deadline passes.
The financial reporting rules also scale with your revenue, specifically for organizations that are actually based in New Hampshire. So if your gross revenue is over $2 million, you're going to need to submit full audited financial statements. If you're between $500,000 and $2 million, you'll need what are called GAAP-compliant statements, which just means they follow generally accepted accounting principles.
Whew, we've covered a lot of ground. So let's just boil this all down into a few key takeaways that will help make sure your organization stays in good standing in the Granite State.
Okay, first and foremost, you've got to shift your thinking from are we asking for money to do we hold or use charitable assets here? Second, that annual report deadline is your key date on the calendar. Do not miss it. Third, always be evaluating your fundraising activity to see if you've crossed that minimum contacts line. And finally, if you think you might be exempt, don't just assume it. You might need to formally confirm that status with the state.
And this really is the bottom line, isn't it? New Hampshire's rules aren't meant to be tricky, but they are absolutely different, because their definition of what counts as charitable activity is so broad. You just can't make assumptions based on how things work in other states. You really have to review these rules carefully to avoid any compliance headaches.
So, this really brings us to our final thought. New Hampshire is the perfect example of why a one-size-fits-all approach to multi-state compliance just plain doesn't work. It really forces you to ask the question, is your strategy flexible enough to handle the outliers, the exceptions, and all the unique rules that states like this can throw at you?